Hey, I'm Emma Ashford. I'm a senior fellow in the New American Engagement Initiative at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council.
And I'm Zack Cooper at the American Enterprise Institute and the Alliance for Securing Democracy.
So, Zack, it's great to get to chat with you face to face on video, if not necessarily in person yet. And I guess, the organizers of this debate asked us to talk pretty broadly about how we think about the way that America engages with the world. So where would you like to start?
I think this place to start is probably in Europe, just given that we've had President Biden do his first major trip abroad. It was a pretty heavy duty trip. And you're already on record about some of your views about how it went. But, my quick take would be, you think about Biden going, he very clearly tried to send the message that he was going to see allies and partners first, before meeting Vladimir Putin. I think he did a pretty effective job, both in London, at the G7, with the European Union, and then with NATO as well. A whole series of meetings on the sidelines of those events too. I think those all went fairly well. We can quibble with little things here and there, but they were generally positive. I think the area where many of us were a bit nervous, at least I was nervous, was how the meeting with Vladimir Putin was going to go. And I think actually it went fine. If anything, it might have been a small positive for Biden. So I think the place to start is just maybe in our assessments of last week. How did you think it went?
Yeah. So, I'm actually not a million miles away from what you're saying on that. I think, one of the downsides of the pandemic has been that Biden didn't get a chance to go out and do his first visits to the traditional sort of, traditionally the UK or Canada or Mexico, or, the countries that you go to traditionally first for presidents. But I guess a kind of an unexpected upside is that Biden got to bundle his first foreign trip with all of these big events all in a row in the order that he wanted, and to send a pretty clear message doing it. So, I think that actually worked out really well for the administration. And I think, the optics of meeting with allies first before meeting with Putin, again, worked out really well for the administration. I will say that the one downside that I see from sort of bundling it all together like this is, you look at the G7 and then it's NATO and the EU and, there was a UK summit on the front. And it kind of made clear how much of this was really just, a little PR love fest, right? Biden saying America's back and the allies saying, hey, we're so glad to have you back. But there wasn't actually that much concrete that came out of it. It was more about the public relations and about the image of it than anything else. And that concerns me a little when we're talking about the future of sort of US-European relations.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I mean, I've had a similar sense from other meetings that Biden has had with foreign leaders when they've come to Washington. So the first one was Prime Minister Suga from Japan, and then President Moon from Korea. And especially the Suga visit, a whole lot of rhetoric that was generally positive, but not a lot of action whatsoever. There was a little bit more on technology, with President Moon. But I do think this is one of the real challenges for the Biden team is they had polling numbers come out the week that Biden did this visit, and the polling numbers basically showed that people had really liked Barack Obama in Europe. They really didn't like Donald Trump, and now they're pretty big fans of Joe Biden. The question is, what do you actually do with those supporters, right? How do you transition and say, okay, we're well liked in Europe, but how do you actually make that useful? I think that the messages in the joint statements were basically the right ones, but it's not quite clear how much of substance was announced. A good example might be the Build Back Better World effort, which is this new initiative theoretically to compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is building infrastructure globally. They announced this big thing. It doesn't seem to have a certain amount of money tied to it. No one quite knows exactly what it is or what it's going to do. It sounds good, but I think the details are still maybe waiting to be developed a little bit.
I mean, I'll say this for the Biden team. They stay on message. They really do. Build back better. The campaign slogan, it's domestic policy, it's foreign policy, it's everything. But you're right. I think it's a slogan much of the time. And it's not really clear what it actually means. And I wanted to go back to that point you made about, people in Europe like Biden and they liked Obama. They didn't like Trump. If you go back a little further, they didn't like Bush either, right? The whole imbroglio around the Iraq war, and people didn't particularly like the Bush administration. They didn't like Dick Cheney, etc. And so there's been this seesaw in European public opinion. And I think that, the underlying tension of these summits is European leaders basically saying, hey, we're happy to have an administration back that we can work with, but we don't really know how far we can trust you. And what happens if Trump or someone like him comes around again in 4 years? And so I think, in parallel to a lot of this, we're still seeing Europeans talk at least a bit about European strategic autonomy, about building up their own capabilities, and if not necessarily building up military capabilities, building up their political and diplomatic autonomy from the United States. And so I don't think this trip really did anything to resolve those tensions. And I'm not really sure the Biden team has a good answer to that other than sort of, we're back, please take us back.
Yeah, Fareed Zakaria had a piece about this, and I didn't agree with all of the piece, but I think the point he was making was along the same lines, which was Biden is saying America is back in Europe, but the problems in Washington still remain. And you're right. There's just nothing the Biden team can do about that, right? I mean, so many of the divisions, first of all, aren't within the Democratic Party. They're within the Republican Party. And so there's nothing that Biden can do to personally resolve those issues. I do think the question that a lot of Europeans are asking, and many allies and partners probably globally as well, is, can you count on the United States, not just until 2024, but after, right? Is the United States going to go back to sort of an America first strategy? And I think you're right. Biden just can't reassure people that won't happen, right? The way he reassures people in some senses is by making sure that he does well enough that he's likely to be reelected. Or maybe have Kamala Harris be elected, who knows. But I think you therefore get this short-term window, especially maybe the next year or two, where you're going to get a lot of cooperation from friends in Europe. And then there's going to be a lot of concern about what's coming next. And so I think you'll see that autonomy continue, not just in Europe, but maybe elsewhere. Maybe one question for you, Emma, is, are there parts of the world where you think there's sort of more trust that the U.S. is going to figure this out than others? It strikes me, for example, that if you look at what's happening in the Middle East, there's not a lot of trust necessarily that the Biden administration can sort of deliver in the long term on the approach that it wants.
Yeah, I mean, I think the increasing partisan polarization of foreign policy is, I wouldn't say global. I think Asia might be, to some extent, the exception. And I'll just say up front, I'm not an Asia expert, but my impression is that just because Democrats and Republicans both seem to be quite aligned on their approach to China, that there is less tension there about a potential flip in administration. But even there, we're seeing these weird trends that we typically haven't really seen before, where different countries back different kinds of presidential administrations, right? So the Trump administration was deeply connected to Netanyahu in Israel, and then, that relationship ends up being a little different when Biden comes into office. And we've seen it in various other places too. So, I mean, it seems to me that that's here to stay. And I think, maybe this is where we could get into a little bit of sort of some differences with us. I think, if you're going to talk about the future of NATO and how the US relates to NATO, what we want it to look like in the future, I worry that the Biden team's approach, which basically seems to be, we're back, there's nothing to worry about, we'll be here again. I think that's really just setting us up for a future in which someone like Trump comes in and pulls the plug on NATO entirely. And I would much rather see a happy medium of reform and burden shifting than I would prefer to see that Trump sort of just killing NATO entirely.
Yeah. So I guess I share some of your concerns about, whether the U.S. is going to always continue its support of NATO. I think even Trump, who seems like he might have wanted to get out of NATO, according to some of the recent memoirs, wasn't able to do it. So I'm a little bit more hopeful that there's some stickiness, institutionally, but I share the worry that if the U.S. is trying to convince NATO to do things that make NATO a little bit uncomfortable, that's going to be really hard if NATO doesn't firmly believe that the U.S. is going to be there and be reliable. So what does that mean? Lots of people were parsing the NATO statement, trying to see how much it talked about China. Talked a tiny bit about China. At the end of the day, though, what NATO is really most useful for is dealing with a threat from Russia. And I don't think anything the U.S. tries to do is going to fundamentally shift that reality. If anything, my sense is the United States has spent a lot of the last 15, 20 years trying to convince NATO to go out of area, where out of area meant Middle East, Iraq, Afghanistan. And actually now what we need to do is convince NATO to focus in area, meaning especially in Eastern Europe. And it turns out that we spent so much time pulling NATO out of area that when the challenge really came from Russia over the last decade in Ukraine, in other parts of Eastern Europe, that actually NATO wasn't nearly as capable as we all had hoped NATO would be. And so I'm sort of hopeful that the path forward for the United States is one where we both encourage Europe to have a bit more autonomy in terms of building some of its own capabilities, but that those autonomous capabilities align well with what we want Europe to have in the NATO context. If that's not the case, then I think we're going to be in big trouble in the years ahead.
It's interesting because, again, I don't disagree with most of that. I mean, I suspect I would probably shift more of the military burden to Europeans, and I suspect I would be more willing to entertain NATO reform or kicking out problematic members like Turkey or Hungary, which is something I would actually value seeing. But yeah, I mean, I think that is the path forward. And instead, it kind of seems like what the Biden administration is doing is saying, well, if the Europeans make some sort of token effort on the China front, and they back us diplomatically on that front. There's been submarines from Europe sailing around the Pacific to, I guess, show willing. And it seems like the Biden team is also almost saying, if you do that, we'll keep up the American military commitment to maintain troops in Europe, to defend you against Russia. And it seems to me that's almost the worst of both worlds.
So let me ask you then, you mentioned, whether the U.S. should maybe kick a couple of, or not the U.S., whether NATO should kick a couple of its members out. And I think I get the sense you're thinking more about the least democratic members, right? Hungary, Turkey are certainly up there. But I'm guessing that you don't want to go quite as far as Stephen Wertheim's suggested recently in the Times of a full reassessment of NATO, and whether the U.S. should be a member of NATO. So I guess when you're thinking about shifting the approach to NATO, what's the driving logic that makes you think that that's necessary, and what are sort of the bounds that you would put around that?
Yeah. So I am I am a realist in my foreign policy orientation. I typically get lumped into this restraint camp that's in Washington, but I think people often don't understand that is quite a lot of different things grouped together. It's basically everybody that wants the US to do slightly less militarily in the world. And that's a pretty big tent, right? That's got Code Pink and John Mearsheimer in it. Those are very different people. So, in terms of NATO, the approach that I would take to NATO is that I want the US to dial down its concrete commitment, not the philosophical commitment, not the Article 5 security commitment, but I want the US to become a guarantor of last resort in the context of European security, rather than the tripwire force on the ground that's the first resort. And I want European states to step up and provide that sort of first line of defense themselves. And I think, NATO, as it's structured right now, where the US provides the majority of the troops, the majority of the funding, the majority of the material, I think that was very justifiable in the early Cold War period. But, if you actually look at the European members of NATO today, they are more populous than the US is. They are richer in GDP terms and GDP per capita terms than the US is. They are capable of doing this for themselves. And I think the US needs to think about focusing elsewhere, we should be shifting that burden. So that's kind of where I come down. There are lots of people in the restraint community that want to see, the US withdraw from NATO entirely. There are others that question whether we have to do some kind of sort of reform or shrinking the alliance to actually make it functional. And I'm a little ambivalent on that because I think it may be necessary, but it's not clear to me how you get there politically. But at a minimum, as I say, I want to see the defense burden shift into Europe.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because I actually don't disagree with much of that. I think you're exactly right that over time, the biggest military challenge for the United States, as you mentioned earlier, is in Asia. It's China. And that's the one where I think the U.S. has to devote more time, energy, resources. And so if the U.S. is choosing between putting more forces into the Pacific, or into the Atlantic, I think it's going to choose the Pacific. And so over time, I think that the path that you're suggesting is probably the one we're going to follow, right? That the U.S. is little by little going to put more of its key capabilities into Asia. It will not shrink in a sort of massive amount the forces it has in Europe, but it's not going to be that Europe's the number one priority, right? And so I think the question then is how you get NATO to step up and do more. I think we've tried asking, I remember I was actually working at the U.S. mission to NATO one summer when Bob Gates came through and sort of harangued our NATO allies that they had to do more. People sort of forget that this happened. It was under the Obama administration. It wasn't a Trumpism. And I think a lot of the European allies heard him and took him very seriously and did nothing. Trump then came in, threatened essentially that the U.S. would do less. A lot of us, might have disagreed with the approach, but look, at the end of the day, some in Europe did end up paying, more for their own defense, not what Trump wanted, which appeared to be some kind of check to the United States, which isn't how NATO works, but that's fine. So Europeans were stepping up more the last few years. I think the question that many of us ask now is, what's the right way to both encourage NATO to do more and step up without damaging the relationship, right? And in some ways, we sort of have an interesting test here. I don't think anyone in the region is worried about Biden withdrawing from Europe or NATO. That doesn't seem to be the path. So the question will be, well, when Europeans are more reassured about U.S. engagement, will they do more or do less? I think if they start doing less, that will be a great area of concern and a very bad sign about the path forward. I think what our European allies need to demonstrate is, look, if the U.S. commits to the region, and to working closely with NATO and other friends in Europe, then Europe can actually sometimes do more itself, right? And not just do more in terms of the amount of defense spending, but also in terms of the kinds of things it's spending on. Because if you're more confident the U.S. is going to be there, then you don't have to replicate U.S. capabilities. You can actually build other capabilities that the alliance broadly needs. So yeah, I think this is the exact question. And very frankly, I don't know what the right answer is. I mean, I think in maybe 2 years, we'll be able to look back and say, okay, Biden comes in, makes these comments, and we'll have a test of whether Europe actually stepped up or stepped back.
See, this is where I'm a bit of a skeptic. I used to believe, right, that if we just pushed countries in Europe, that maybe they would step up and contribute more, particularly after 2014 and the Russian invasion of Crimea. But it typically isn't the case. And, it's not just all the way back into the Obama administration. I mean, if you go back far enough, you can find like Truman and Eisenhower saying things about burden sharing and the Europeans need to pay more. And I think this is just a classic moral hazard problem, right? As long as the US is there providing this, Europeans are not going to build up their capacity. And so, for me, the problem or the puzzle is, how do you get them to step up without it being sort of a Trumpian, the US withdraws tomorrow and there's this gap where nobody's there to cover. And so from my point of view, what I would like to see is a commitment from this administration or a future administration to, a 10 or 12 year process of drawing down those troops while giving European states the opportunity to backfill. And I think that's very achievable and meets US foreign policy goals more broadly. But again, I don't think that's where this administration is. And I don't think it's where a future Trumpian administration would be either.
Yeah, I think you're probably right on that. Well, maybe it makes sense then to pivot, let's say, to some place where I think there is a real desire, not just in the Biden team, but maybe among others in the US, to see more of a drawdown, which is the Middle East. Obviously, we're pulling some forces out of Afghanistan. Exactly how long that's going to take, it's a bit unclear. I think many of us had been thinking it might be the full drawdown might be done by July 4th, but it now looks like it might take a bit longer. And I think many members of the Biden team have been quite explicit that they would support a decrease in the U.S. presence in the Middle East. Can I take a wild guess and suggest that I'm guessing you are supportive of that effort as well?
I may have said some things on that in the past. It's just possible. You might be able to find that on the record.
I actually teach one of those pieces for the record.
I think the Biden team is perhaps not where I am on this, but I think they're heading in that direction. And I think, we've seen not just the decision to draw down and withdraw from Afghanistan. We've seen, the US military moving some weapons systems out of the Middle East, particularly anti-aircraft capabilities and, with the intention of moving those out to Asia. And to me, that signals, that the Biden team is pretty serious about this, that they basically acknowledge what has become kind of a long-running, it was a long-running debate in Washington, but I think many people have come around to the idea that the Middle East is not nearly as important as we have made it in US foreign policy in the last couple of years, and that the US military presence in the region is perhaps not doing what we actually want it to do. So there's all this talk about bringing stability or, deterring Iran or combating terrorism. And, with a few exceptions like, the concrete campaign against ISIS, I think the US presence in the region has not necessarily done those things.
Yeah, that's fair. And look, I worked in the Bush administration, and I think many of us would admit that, much of what the Bush administration hoped to accomplish in the Middle East, it didn't accomplish, right? And some of those actions were in fact, damaging to much of what the administration was hoping to do. I think the tough question now is, what level of effort is sort of the right one? Whenever I suggest to some of my Bush administration friends that, we should refocus a bit more on Asia and do somewhat less in the Middle East, I always get the comment back from them that, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. And most of me doesn't find this very persuasive, except that you can go back and look at almost all of our recent presidents, and they pretty much all wanted to get out of the Middle East. And almost all of them failed. And the ones that succeeded then were drawn back in, right? I mean, you think about, Biden has already made this commitment. We'll see if he can follow through. Trump desperately wanted to get out of the Middle East. He got out of Iraq and then got back in, and he couldn't get out of Afghanistan. Obama ran in part on getting out of the Middle East. Again, tried to get out of Iraq and couldn't fully do it. Well, he did, and then had to get back in, and couldn't get out of Afghanistan at all. And even Bush, people forget when Bush ran initially, he was not a big fan of a big Middle East presence. And I think you could probably go back and say the same thing about Bill Clinton. So it strikes me that this is an aspiration that many strategists have had to shift focus to the areas of the world where maybe the economic growth is happening and the populations are a bit more large and dynamic, especially in Asia. But that at the end of the day, despite these political promises that we keep getting drawn back into the Middle East. And then the argument you get into, and I don't always support this, but I think it's one worth debating, is look, if you know you're probably going to get drawn back in, why not keep some presence there so that you can at least guard against the worst outcomes? And so you're not building up from zero next time that you get forced for political reasons to re-engage in the region. So, interested in your reaction to that argument.
Well, I think your last line there is really the interesting one. You said, how do you not get drawn back in for political reasons? And I have come to think of US presence in the Middle East as a political problem, not a strategic problem. If you engage with, military planners, experts in the region, they will almost uniformly agree that, that maybe we're doing a little good, but it's not as important as all that. We could be doing better things. But then when you actually get down to sort of brass tacks of, what should we withdraw from the region? You find everybody goes a little squishy on it. And that's because they think of the examples like the rise of ISIS, where Obama chose to go back into Iraq. And I've come to think of the Middle East and withdrawal, as a problem a little analogous to, so what political economists describe as a J curve, right? And this is a concept that comes out of like economic reform literature. But it's basically the notion that, sometimes things get worse before they get better. And my feeling is that what happens is every time the US makes these noises, or even starts to do a withdrawal, things get a little bit worse and politicians panic and put the troops back in. And if we just let things go for a little longer, perhaps we would see that wasn't necessary. Now that's not a problem I can solve. That's not a problem strategists can solve generally. It's a political problem. And I think, this is actually one thing I'll give Donald Trump credit for. I think his decision to say we're getting out of Afghanistan was in some ways a political gift to Joe Biden, because now Biden, if things go bad, can blame his predecessor. And I feel like that's really the only way we're ever going to fully disentangle this. But ultimately, if we could get past that political problem, what I would like to see in the Middle East is an American naval presence. So focused on freedom of the sea lanes. That's a mission that we've undertaken for decades in the region. And a small, capable counterterrorism force. But that is an order of magnitude less than what we have there today. And it looks much more like our presence in the region looked in, say, the late Cold War than it does, the force that we have there today.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point that, if you think about the sort of structure of U.S. forces in the region, right, we do operate from a number of very large bases, especially along the Persian Gulf. And so I think some of the hard choices, right, are which of these bases do you continue to invest in? Do you pull out from some? And, the worry I have is that some of that offshore capability, the naval capability to do counterterrorism strikes, it might actually require some capabilities that we really need elsewhere. The most recent example of this is that the United States has pulled its only aircraft carrier that's at the moment, operating globally, and it usually is in Japan, and it pulled it out of Asia. And, friends of mine in Singapore were just posting pictures of it sailing through Singapore, going, in my view, the wrong way, going to the Middle East. And why is that? Because we have to protect the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So, we needed forces to deal with Afghanistan when the war was going on. Now we're going to need forces to cover the withdrawal when we're getting out. And then my concern is, well, in a few months from now, people are going to come back and say, well, we really need naval forces now because now we have no one in Afghanistan. And now we're entirely dependent on the capabilities, of the Navy. And I think it puts a huge burden on the Navy to then carry out some missions that frankly, it's not perfectly positioned to do and definitely doesn't have the capacity to do. So it's not that I disagree with some of your assessment. I just worry about whether we've built the Navy that we need to be able to, deal with some of the challenges from Russia, deal with a bit of the deterrence challenges and counterterrorism maybe that we're going to have to be doing in the Middle East, and handle the China challenge, which, oh, by the way, is mostly a maritime challenge.
I mean, I don't disagree with that. And I think part of it is that what I'm saying is not that we should be continuing a very heavy-handed military-focused counterterrorism campaign from offshore instead of onshore. I'm saying we need minimal sort of special operations focused, counterterrorism capabilities, not this kind of large scale. We're not fighting a battle against ISIS, right? And so I do think that requires fewer capabilities. But I guess the other problem here, and that often strikes me as, our presence in the Middle East is a little self-perpetuating in this way, because much of what these assets are doing is force protection. And if we don't have as many forces in the region, we don't need as many assets to protect them. And so the large bases that we have right now are very prone to, or very vulnerable to, missile and rocket attacks. They're prone to attacks from militant groups. And if we were not to have that large footprint onshore, the risks would be lower to start with. So I mean, again, there is probably a need for some capability there, but my impression is that much of what we're doing right now is simply the things that enable us to be there. And that's rather pointless.
Yeah, I think that's a fair concern. The only worry I have in that regard is, if some of this strategy works, right? If you get a new nuclear deal with Iran, for example, right? If you can tamp down tensions with Iran, you're out of Afghanistan. You can hope that the Iraqi government is able to sort of get a hold on some of the challenges in Iraq itself. Then I think it's easier to imagine a smaller U.S. presence. And then, as you said, you need less force protection, which means you can have a smaller U.S. presence, which means you need less force protection, and it's a virtuous cycle. I think the danger is if the Biden team doesn't get the Iran nuclear deal, it's going to be very hard for them to do this drawdown that I think they intend on. And then I think they're in a tough spot where, they can't really draw down many more forces from the Middle East. They're already pulling forces out of Afghanistan, but having to backfill them, as you noted, with maybe even some limited capabilities. But like you're not going from 2,500 troops in Afghanistan to 0 troops caring about Afghanistan. You're going to have some forces postured around the region to deal with potential challenges there. And so then I think they're in a really tough spot where it's not clear where you get the savings. It doesn't mean that they're wrong to get out of Afghanistan or to look to decrease the forces, but I think a lot of this is dependent on this Iran nuclear deal going through over the next year or two.
I'm not sure I actually agree with that.
Okay.
Because I don't think the two are necessarily linked in that way. I mean, I think linking them like that implies that that the nuclear deal will resolve so many of the problems that we have with Iran that somehow we don't need the forces there. Whereas the argument that I would make is, to be honest, we don't really need most of those forces there regardless. Now that still leaves the nuclear problem unsolved, which is a huge problem. But I think, if the last couple of decades have proven anything, it's that military force is not really, is not the solution to nuclear proliferation. It tends not to do any good. So again, I'm just not sure that I see the linkage there.
I guess my concern would be, so if you can't get a nuclear deal with Iran, put aside the question of what the Iranians might do, I then worry more about nuclear proliferation within the rest of the region, right? What does Saudi Arabia do? I'm not suggesting that Turkey or Egypt would necessarily acquire nuclear weapons, but I think they'd certainly have greater incentive to think about these kinds of choices. So the worry I would have isn't necessarily that you need all of those forces for deterrence against Iran. It's more about the reassurance question, especially with the Saudis. And if the U.S. tries and fails to get Iran back into the nuclear deal, and it becomes quite clear that Iran is going to have nuclear weapons, how then do you convince Saudi Arabia not to do the same, other than stationing a large number of forces there? That's my worry. I
mean, to be honest, even with U.S. forces there, the Saudis have been taking steps in that direction. So again, I'm not convinced this is a problem that we can solve. And I agree with you that like sort of this unchecked nuclear arms race in the region, it would be a major problem. And I'm not trying to downplay that it would be a major problem. But we've seen the Saudis and the Emiratis in recent years pursuing the steps that would actually enable them to get a nuclear deterrent if they wanted one. And so even with this US commitment, I think that possibility is there. But perhaps this is a good place for us to actually pivot away, because I noticed that somewhat ironically, we're spending much of our time talking about the Middle East, which, just like US foreign policy, is not actually the major concern of policymakers today, right? So maybe we could start talking about Asia a little.
And here I'm interested, I don't know whether we're going to agree or disagree on a lot of Asia policies. So where I think there actually tends to be more agreement between international engagement supporters and the restraint crowd is in Asia, right? And the argument you'll hear made sometimes is that, yeah, look, if the Europeans wanted to get their act together, they could deal with Russia. But if Asian allies and partners get their act together, they still can't deal with China on their own. China is just too big and too powerful. And Asia as a region tends to be much more divided. There's no NATO and there's not going to be in Asia. So sometimes you'll hear some pretty prominent, realist voices. And you mentioned John Mearsheimer earlier, but I think Steve Walt would be another one, say basically, look, we should adopt, a strategy, whatever you want to call it. It could be offshore balancing. It could be selective engagement, but we should be much more careful about where we should engage. That means often for them, less engagement in the Middle East, maybe even less in Europe, but sometimes even more in Asia, right? Because Asia is kind of the one place where actually, if the US pulls back, it's not necessarily that the rest of the region can just do more and solve a problem. It might not be able to, because China is just so big and powerful. So I'm interested in your thoughts. Which of those views do you hold? Do you think we need to have more of a presence in Asia? Do you think there is an argument to have less of one? Which way do you come out?
Yeah. So, no, it's a great question. And I think, Asia is the place, I think, where advocates of restraint have typically the most in common with others in DC, but also just a wide range of divergent opinions inside that sort of grouping itself. So, I'll say for myself, I am a card-carrying offshore balancer, realist, or I would be if we had cards, I guess. And yeah, so for me, pivoting away from the Middle East and burden sharing, in Europe, these are things that help me to say, well, then the US can turn and deal with China, which I consider to be sort of the major coming threat for the US. But even within that framework, I think most restrainers and even most realists like myself would suggest that our current approach is still a little problematic. And it has a lot to do with how you approach this China challenge. So America's current approach is, pretty heavy force posture in the region, right? I mean, to be honest, if there is a hegemon in Asia militarily right now, it's the United States. So we're very heavily forward postured in the region. And we are mostly approaching, a rising China. We're mostly approaching it from this point of view of we need to contain it. We need to deter it. If we don't have enough force, China will take all these steps and start to seize territory. And that would be a disaster. And I think, many restrainers and myself included would say that that's also really problematic. I can simultaneously hold in my head that China might be a threat to the US because it's a rising great power, and worry about the risks of war from some sort of inadvertent security spiral that we cause by our heavy forward presence. So the way that I kind of like to characterize it is most restrainers, particularly the academic focused ones, are much more concerned about the security dilemma in the context of Asia, that is sort of unforeseen, unexpected conflict that spirals out of control. They're more concerned about that than they are about deterrence failures, which is what you'll often hear from people in Washington. So Michelle Flournoy, for example, had an article in Foreign Affairs, I think last year, talking about how the biggest risk of war in Asia is a deterrence failure. And so to me, that is the key distinction in how we would approach Asia. But I'm curious what you think.
Well, I think that's exactly the right distinction. And, this question of sort of how do you stop things from getting worse in Asia is maybe what motivates the theoretical debate you were talking about, right? And I think you come out, as you said, with sort of two different views. One is that, you need more of a presence because the challenge is actually that China hasn't been deterred enough. And then the other is that actually there's been too much presence and that has forced China to take actions that it wouldn't otherwise have taken. I'm very much in the first camp, which is not to say that I think we have entirely tested the alternative. I think the Obama team, especially in the last few years, it wanted to see whether a more cooperative approach to China would lead to a more cooperative approach from Beijing itself. And I think the answer was no. And it's not because I think that the Communist Party is evil and terrible. And, there are people who believe that. I think what the Communist Party has been doing in Xinjiang and Hong Kong is evil and terrible. But I think most of the actions by the leadership of the Communist Party are just classic great power actions, right? When you're a great power and you're rising and you, especially after, say, 2008, 2009, start to become more confident, right? Confident in your power, politically, militarily, economically, you start to do things that make other people, other countries really uncomfortable. And that's not abnormal. That's the path that all great powers follow. We tend not to teach this in the United States, but if you go back and look at U.S. history in the 1890s, it's not the most peaceful of histories. We go find a good, weak European power to beat up on just to prove the point that we can. I think what worries me about China is that I don't think there's a world in which the U.S. now, first of all, is capable politically of pulling back and giving China the room that some people would want. So I think that option is, first of all, off the table. And then the question is, okay, if that's off the table, can you incentivize Beijing to operate in ways that we think are more acceptable or not? And I'm not sure that I think that much of our effort to shape Chinese behavior has been particularly effective recently. I think this is the big debate that people haven't had, but they should have. So when I look at the story of the last decade, I think it's largely a story of China doing what it wants to do regardless of what the United States does, not because of U.S. action, right? So I know there are some people who think, China's just had to take this action against Hong Kong because the U.S. did something, or it's pushing Taiwan because the U.S. did something. I don't see the data for that. My sense is more that actually what Washington needs to do is maybe talk a little bit less, but build up the capabilities that it needs to deter a conflict. So this is kind of back to the Teddy Roosevelt line, right, of walk softly but carry a big stick. I think the problem we've had recently is that the Trump approach was often to sort of walk very loudly and carry the same stick you've already had, right? Like there wasn't a lot of change in the U.S. posture in Asia over the last decade. You mentioned Michelle Flournoy. She was the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy when the pivot to Asia was announced, and she said that there wasn't much of a change in the last decade. So, I think people on both sides have some responsibility to now say, okay, we've said that the U.S. needs more deterrence. We actually haven't delivered that deterrence, which I think has been part of the problem in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, I think even just talking about it can sometimes be potentially problematic, right? Because we talk about we're going to build up in Asia, we're going to, push China back and make sure it doesn't try anything, and something that I see that is very problematic, and perhaps this will get us into a really hot button topic, is conversations about US commitments that actually seek to extend those commitments and make them more concrete. And I'm mostly referring to Taiwan here. So, we've seen, I think, a fairly concerted push in Washington over the last last few years to imply that the Taiwan Relations Act actually obligates the US to go in and defend Taiwan militarily if China intends anything. And that's the kind of statement that, if it were to come out of an administration officially in the future, that is the kind of statement that could actually prompt military action from China. And this is part of why we're seeing these ongoing debates about, whether the US should defend Taiwan, can it defend Taiwan? And for me, a third and sort of most important point is, what do China's intentions about Taiwan really tell us about China's intentions more broadly? And I think there's a lot of sort of conflation of those issues, all focused on this debate about US-Taiwanese relationships and that are effectively an attempt to sort of shift the goalposts in Asia. And so that's the sort of thing that really concerns me here, is that this isn't just about building up deterrence. This is about shifting the goalposts even further kind of in China's direction.
Yeah. And this is where I think you and I do probably disagree. So my view is that I do think that so I agree with you that there is no treaty commitment to Taiwan, right? There used to be. It doesn't exist anymore. We got rid of it in the 1970s. I do think, though, that the U.S. has been very clear that it was opposed to unification through non-peaceful means. And I think it's become more and more clear that China wants unification, and that the peaceful means that might have been open a few years ago are not on the table anymore. And that's not America's fault. That's China's fault, because of what China did, in particularly Hong Kong, which has convinced many in Taiwan that the last thing that Taiwanese want is to become part of China. And in fact, that the promises that had long been made about how Taiwan could have a separate system, right? This one country, two systems model, which sort of was supposed to apply to Hong Kong. It has been destroyed in Hong Kong. It doesn't carry any water anymore in Taiwan either as a result. So I think now we're at the difficult point where China had promised that it wouldn't use non-peaceful means to unify Taiwan and China. It now has gotten rid of its ability to use peaceful means because it's been so heavy-handed in Hong Kong that it's convinced almost the large majority of people in Taiwan that they want nothing to do with that path. And so now what's left, because of China's own actions, are non-peaceful options. And on those, the U.S. actually did make some commitments between the 3 communiques and the 6 assurances. Not that this is a hard and fast commitment, but it didn't commit not to intervene either. And where I think you and I would probably agree is I actually don't believe that the U.S. should come out and make a position strategically clear that says that the U.S. will, no matter what, intervene in an invasion of Taiwan. I'm not against that because I don't think we should defend Taiwan. I actually think we should if that is forced upon us. I'm against it because I think it is a terrible strategic move. And Emma, if you'll permit me just a minute on this, what it reminds me of is if you think back to the Korean War, right? Part of the reason the U.S. gets in the Korean War is it effectively says that the U.S. is going to fight in maritime Asia, but not in continental Asia. And then we find out actually the U.S. was willing to fight in continental Asia too, and we just hadn't said that beforehand, which is part of why our adversaries end up starting the conflict, because they thought we weren't committed. Well, here what worries me is when you start drawing these clear red lines, it's actually not quite so simple. So if you say the U.S. will defend Taiwan, period, what happens when there's a Chinese attack against not Formosa, the main island of Taiwan, but against the outlying islands, which the U.S. can't physically defend? So you can't defend them, Taiwan can't defend them, so you let it go. That's all you could do, right? But then, if you're going to do that, it weakens the promise that you've made, right? You've said that you are going to defend Taiwan and you haven't done it. So you get in this terrible position where you have to start figuring out exactly what the red line covers, right? Covers Formosa, but not Kinmen. And then all of a sudden you find out, oh, well, the second you cover Formosa, but don't cover the outlying islands, the Chinese have an incentive to grab the outlying islands because you've said it's not in the defensive zone. So I think this is the real problem, is that there's no way to draw this clear red line around Taiwan, this unambiguous red line, without creating more problems for yourself. So even though I'm supportive of being very clear with Beijing that the U.S. would be willing to intervene in one of these cases, I'm not supportive of the argument for strategic clarity that Richard Haass and others in Washington have been making recently.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny because you're basically having a debate about where we should draw a deterrent line. And I would frame it totally differently. I would frame the line question in terms of where should we defend from the point of view of US interests? Not so you're saying where should we defend that will be a credible deterrent, that will be making a credible promise. And I'm saying, well, where should we defend, where is strategically important to us? And from that point of view, I am fairly persuaded by the arguments that Taiwan is very difficult to defend, and not so strategically significant to the US. Like many other offshore balancers, I'll admit this is sort of a hole in the theory, or a flaw, is that it's not particularly clear where in Asia you would draw that line. And this is one of the sort of broad distinctions in the restraint camp. I would say realists would probably say that the US has to be in Asia to some extent. Some restrainers might draw that line as far back as, Hawaii. Right. But I mean, I think the question is not necessarily, how do we make our deterrent about China credible? It's about, what do we actually need from the point of view of US interests? And, I would argue that we're talking about freedom of navigation, for commercial purposes within within the Asia Pacific. We're talking about being able to engage with the countries in that region. But I'm not necessarily talking about stepping up to defend other Asian countries from China, in a way that I think you are. And perhaps this leads us into, I guess, one last point of contention that I think maybe we should talk about, which is, what is the role of sort of ideology, democracy, autocracy in all of this? Because I think that's one of the distinctions here.
Yeah, I think that's right. And let me come back to that in just a second, because I think you've hit on some important assumptions where we might differ, right? So I do think first that Taiwan is defendable. I don't think we've necessarily done what we need to defend Taiwan, or that Taiwan has done what it needs to defend itself. But I think actually the challenge of defending Taiwan is easier than some people have made it out to be. Not to say that it's easy, but I think it's doable, because China has to do a very massive amphibious invasion across a fairly large body of water against an island that's been preparing for this for 70 years. And oh, by the way, the biggest military in the world. That's tough. That's the hardest military operation you can have globally, and you've got to do it against some pretty capable challengers, to say nothing of whether Japan might be forced to get involved as well. So I think that we might disagree about how defendable Taiwan is. We might disagree about how strategically important Taiwan is. I would just point out, if you have an iPhone, the core chip in your iPhone is made by TSMC, which is made in Taiwan. If we lose Taiwan, you lose all those supply chains. And that's not the only reason that I would defend Taiwan, but I think it is probably strategically more important, than some people believe. And then I think the other area where you and I might differ is, I think it's very hard to defend, say, Japan in particular, but also the Philippines, which are treaty allies, if you lose Taiwan. It's not that you can't do it, but it's the fact that, right now, if you're a Chinese ship and you want to get from the Chinese coast out into the open waters of the Pacific, you have to go through this archipelago. And that is basically going through waters that cross from Japan and its southwestern islands to Taiwan down through the Philippines. And that's a littoral area where the U.S. can watch things pretty closely. The second you take Taiwan out, it becomes much easier for ships in particular and submarines to leak out into the Western Pacific without the U.S. finding them. And so I think the defense problem gets harder then too. So those are maybe some quibbles I might have, but I think but the point here is basically the same, which is that those are debates that we never have in probably the detail we need to be having them. And they're kind of foundational to the Taiwan question, right? And I think you're right that most of the time we just jump to these questions of like, should we defend Taiwan or should we not, without actually having the debate about the core assumptions that underlie the logic of our strategies. Should we come back to the question on values?
Yeah, I guess so. Let's finish up with this because, you know, I feel like there was this whole debate about Taiwan recently, and I feel like at heart what it really came down to was, a relatively realist writer, Charlie Glazer, writing this article in Foreign Affairs in which he basically lays out the strategic case for why the US shouldn't defend Taiwan. And most of the criticism against him was not couched in terms of, well, Taiwan is defensible. It was instead couched in terms of, you are a monster who are abandoning 27 million Taiwanese citizens of a democracy to Chinese machinations. And so the terms of the debate, I thought, were very sort of revealing in that people suggested that perhaps it wasn't about strategy or security, it was about values, and that was the playing field on which the US should be fighting.
So what's interesting is I agree that we should be playing in part on the field of values. That's not the logic of why I would defend Taiwan, but let me start by saying, I think too often the debate in Washington is focused on people, and it should be focused on ideas. And I think it was wrong of people to attack Charlie Glazer as some sort of, terrible person. Anyone that knows Charlie Glazer knows he's just a wonderful, thoughtful, kind person. I have had debates with him on his Taiwan views. He's the nicest guy, and he'll be the first person to say, I might be wrong about this. And I think sometimes, we, for whatever reason, get a little scared of having these debates in a friendly manner. And maybe it's just that people don't know Charlie, but still, I think the way we go about these debates sometimes is pretty far off from the way we should handle them. But let me come back to the substance. So I think there's a values argument, not just on the Taiwan issue, but more broadly that we shouldn't walk away from. And here I think you and I will probably very strongly disagree with one another. So I didn't always believe this, but I guess I've come around to the view that at the end of the day, if the reason that the US is competing with China is just about pure power, and that this is just about the United States being a declining hegemon that doesn't want to give up its power in East Asia, that's a pretty terrible reason for us to do anything. It's a really terrible reason for our friends to want to support us. And I actually don't think it's really at the core of what's going on. If you look at polling data, what's really gotten people worried about China in the last few years, it's not the explosion of Chinese power. That's been going on for decades. It's the fact that they know what's going on in Xinjiang and Hong Kong and more broadly repression in China, and some pretty concerning actions by the Chinese military, whether it's in the East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, on the China-Indian border. Like, these are all things that have motivated concerns. And I don't think they're necessarily concerns about power. I think they're concerns about how that power is exercised and for what purposes. And so for me, I actually think that values are pretty important here. Not just values in terms of having things that we believe in that we're pushing for and real goals, but also values that unite us, both with other countries and ourselves, for something rather than just against something. And I'm not a huge fan of the term great power competition for this reason, because I think it focuses us on a power competition between two countries when actually that's the wrong metric for us. What we should be thinking about is the competition about the values, about how we think the world should operate. And I don't think it's, number one, about power. And I don't think it's just a US-China dynamic. I think it's a dynamic where a lot of countries are really worried about what China's been doing. And that's true of many in Asia, and it's true of many around the world. So I'm not shy of the values issues. And last word on this, as Emily, I think the Biden administration is pretty close to where I would be on this. And some of us back in November, right before the election, put out a piece called Linking Values to Strategy, which advocated for an approach that linked values to strategy. And the Biden team has done it. So that makes me happy. It's not to say I think they've done it perfectly, but I broadly agree with the emphasis on values that they've had over the last over the last 6 months or so.
Yeah, and just an aside on that, actually, it's funny because I feel like on the Russia question, which we sort of just bypassed, the Biden team has actually unlinked values from strategy, that they're actually doing the interests bit and not values. So it's kind of interesting how they're dealing with different problems. But I'm afraid on the ideology question, I really couldn't disagree more. I think we both wrote some articles a while back talking about the question of great power competition. And forgive me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but my interpretation of sort of, you wrote an article with Hal Brands, and my interpretation of your article was that basically you said the US will triumph in this competition with China, when the regime in Beijing changes. That might be a little blunter than you put it, but that was basically what you said. And I just don't think that's accurate. I could see if the regime in Beijing changed tomorrow miraculously into a democracy, I could see, some period where relations aren't quite as antagonistic. But I don't think that ideology and regime type is what is driving all of China's behavior over the last couple of years, or indeed the sort of US response to it. I think it's as much to do with power and in particular with China feeling that it now has the capacity, the military capacity and the economic power to sort of throw its weight around on the global stage. And I think that is, as you say, classic rising great power behavior. And it's just not clear to me that it's ideology that's driving it as opposed to maybe just making it a little worse. So from the point of view of the Biden team's approach to China and, all this talk about a summit of democracies and, building an alliance of democracies and the D10 and these things, I'm all for democracies getting together to talk about ways in which we can deal with common problems, ways in which we can defend democratic societies from things like kleptocratic money flows or corruption or, things that concern us. But when we start getting into conversations about democracies banding together in alliances to take on China, to take on, autocracies globally, I start to get worried because that seems to me to be a framing that pushes us back towards a Cold War, like we saw in the late 20th century, or even some kind of a hot war, right? That we saw, at the start of the 20th century or before. So I just think this framing is inherently problematic. So I'm going to have to disagree with you entirely on that one.
And we're not going to come to agreement on this, but let me just make one quick pitch, which is, so it's not that I think you and I actually agree that most of China's actions are not driven by ideology. And Jessica Chen Weiss has written a number of pieces on this, which I think are quite convincing. That is a separate question then from whether the US should respond by talking about values. And part of my view is that when I talk to Chinese friends, they'll often say, oh, you guys have to stop talking about values, right? And I'll push them on this and I'll push them. And sometimes where I get is I get a bit convinced that actually the reason my Chinese friends want us to stop talking about values is because they know that the Communist Party has no appealing argument there. Communist Party can talk about how strong it is militarily, how strong it is economically. Politically, China's delivering for its people. But when you talk about values, China's really at a disadvantage. So I think we have to detach the question from whether China approaches this all ideologically. And I mean, we could have a debate about that and Xi Jinping thought and all these things. And then a question of what the optimal US response is. And I think it's possible that even if China isn't quite as ideological, that there is actually an asymmetric edge for the US in relying a bit more on this values discussion, even if it makes our Chinese friends very uncomfortable, and maybe sometimes because it makes them uncomfortable because they know they don't have a competitive answer.
Well, honestly, I think that's a pretty good note to end on. The value of open, public, free debate, right? That's what we're doing here, and we probably wouldn't be able to do in China. So, so thanks so much for joining me and for agreeing to do this debate. I hope people find it interesting.
Thanks, Emma. Great chatting.